Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has apologized for not recusing himself from the cabinet decision to award a government contract to We, a charity his family has links to. Specifically, last week it was revealed the Prime Minister's brother and mother together were paid nearly $300,000 for speaking engagements with the charity. We know that the Ethics Commissioner is already investigating the question of whether the Prime Minister contravened the Conflict of Interest Act, and it marks the third such investigation Trudeau has found himself at the center of. Will the Prime Minister's apology yesterday affect the outcome of that investigation, and what else might the Ethics Commissioner be looking at? Mary Dawson served as the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner for a decade, from 2007 to 2017. She joins us from her home in Ottawa. Hi, Ms. Dawson. Good to see you.
Hi. I can't see you, but I'm talking to you.
Thank you very much for making time for our program. I wanted to start off just with a general question. As you watch everything that's happened over the past few weeks, and in particular, the commencement of an investigation, an investigation by the Ethics Commissioner, what's going through your mind? What is your general take on what's happened?
Well, I think it's a normal activity. I'm not sure. I mean, I see that the investigation has been started. Obviously, there's some grounds for it because, especially since Mr. Trudeau has accepted that he should have recused. So I'm just watching it with interest.
Let me pick up on that point that the Prime Minister yesterday admitted and apologized for not recusing himself. Does that impact, the determination ultimately made when it comes to the Conflict of Interest Act?
Well, it would be pretty hard to backtrack from that statement, I think. When he says he failed to recuse, recusal is one of the provisions of the Act. If there's a conflict of interest, it suggests that there's also a conflict of interest somewhere in there. So I think it'd be a little difficult not to find that he contravened Section 21, which is the recusal provision.
Do you think it's likely, because of that apology yesterday, because of his comments, that he would be found to contravene that particular aspect of the Act?
Well, I would be surprised if he wasn't, but that's up to the Ethics Commissioner, and who knows what may transpire in between now and then. Let me ask you a little bit sort of behind the scenes how it might work when it comes to figuring out or looking into the possibility of that act being contravened. Obviously, the recusal is one aspect of it, but what happens in the Ethics Commissioner's office? Do they look at all possible portions of the act that were contravened? Do they narrow it down initially? And if you were doing it, what aspects specifically would you be looking into? Well, I mean, the obvious one is obviously the recusal one now, and I think Section 6, and in fact I think I've heard it mentioned that the Section 6 was under review, and probably 7. 6 is the basic one of not acting in your job where there's a conflict of interest, and 7 is the one that has not to give preferential treatment to someone. So both of those would appear to be at least questionable, and one could look into those. I'm not sure whether there are other ones. The area that don't know much about really at this point is the rules around sending out contracts to other bodies, and there may be stuff in there that needs to be looked at too, but I don't know what the rules are, so
Right. On the subject of specifically then on the recusal, if that is found to be the case, what is the penalty levied in that instance?
There are no penalties under the Act except for what we call administrative monetary penalties for failures to report certain things to within deadlines. There could be a recommendation, but usually in my time I didn't have many recommendations. But normally there's no penalty. The penalty effectively is the report, or the opprobrium that comes with having a report found you to have contravened, if that's the case.
I remember interviewing you a few years ago, I think back in 2018, when you were exiting the role of the Ethics Commissioner. And at the time, I think that I had asked you about the lack of penalties, because there was some conversation from MPs at the time about increasing the penalties, or sort of giving the office more teeth. And you resisted that. And you said, I remember in that interview, that you thought that, that's the criminal domain. that isn't the domain of the ethics commissioner, and that the sort of public shame that comes across, and I'm paraphrasing, that comes along with the publishing of a public report, like the one into the Aga Khan trip, for example, was enough to deter it in the future. Do you still think that, given that we're now on the third ethics investigation?
Yes, I actually do tend to think that. And, you know, it's not, there could be some penalties that aren't in the criminal domain, by the way, but they'd be relatively minor. No, I'm not a, I think that the ethics commissioner, it's not a criminal level of judgment, it's a civil level, a reasonable probability and reason. So it's not like the criminal beyond a reasonable doubt, so it's a different level of proof. But beyond that, I think getting the information out about what's been done wrong is the important thing.
Do you think it acts as any kind of deterrent, though, I guess is what I mean, given that your investigation was the first, there happened to be a second in which the Prime Minister was found to contravene the act, and now there was a third in which the outcome has yet to be determined?
Yeah, well, obviously, of course, each of the three are different, although the first, my one and this one that's currently under has some similarities. The second one was a bit different. You know, normally one doesn't continue to do the same thing twice. But it just, you know, what can I say? There seems to be a little bit of a blind spot or something there.
Do you think there is a role for the ethics commissioner in any of that, I guess? If in fact there is a blind spot, is there a role for the ethics commissioner there, beyond just investigating each individual instance?
No, I don't think so. I think it's, I mean, there's Parliament, there's the public, there's everything else. And I think the Ethics Commissioner's job is to consider the situation and see whether the rules have been contravened.
How long do you anticipate this investigation taking, given that it is kind of obviously not identical, but in a similar vein to the one that you conducted, which was fairly lengthy?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of provisions involved in the one I did, and there was also one that was jointly under the Act and the Code. That one took me about a year, I think, as I recall. There have been others that have taken me a little longer. What I don't know is the extent to which this business about going outside the government to other people to fulfill the contract will bear on that, but that may be more an Auditor General thing than an ethics thing. I don't, you know, so it's not unusual if it takes 8, 10, 12 months, because there are delays written into the Act on the way you proceed, the procedural rules. So on the other hand, maybe it could go quite a bit quicker.
One final question for you before I let you go, Ms. Dawson, and that is around the timing of all of this. Initially, when the Ethics Commissioner, released a statement saying that they would investigate this, it was prior to the revelation that the Prime Minister's mother and brother had been paid by the We charity nearly $300,000. Does that change the assessment or the nature of the investigation going forward for the Ethics Commissioner from your perspective?
I think it does. I mean, right there, there's we know now that there's family that will benefit, that potentially have a beneficial situation with the person that got the contract. So, if that hadn't been the case, there's the question of the extent to which Mr. Trudeau himself had a relationship, and all that has to be looked into.
Okay.
But yeah. Okay.
Okay. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Ms. Dawson. I appreciate your time very much this evening.
Okay, I appreciate it. Bye.
Bye. Those comments from the former Ethics Commissioner come on the heels of Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet repeating the Prime Minister should step aside, not down, while the sole source contract awarded to the We charity to manage a $900 million student service grant program is studied. So should the Prime Minister step aside until the investigations are complete? We know that's probably not likely, but we'd like the Power Panel to weigh in on that and what we heard from Mary Dawson. Let's start from west to east in Edmonton. Former Cabinet Minister Amarjeet Sohi. In Saskatoon tonight, former Director of Communications to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, now managing partner at Rubicon Strategy, Corey Teneycke. And in Gatineau, just across the river, political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin. Good evening to all three of you. Thanks for your patience. Great to see you.
Nice to
Great to
see
see you.
Amarjeet, I'm going to begin with you. Mary Dawson, in the interview I did with her, she was making that comment around a blind spot because her investigation into the trip associated with the Aga Khan, she said, had some similarities to this third one. Do you agree with her assessment that the Prime Minister appears to have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to ethics?
I think Prime Minister made a big mistake by not recusing himself from the decision related to we. I am glad that he has apologized and recognized the mistake that he made. It would have been obvious from the start that the close connection of his and his family to the we would have been flagged earlier on for him by his staff, and he should have recused. But having said that, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We are, recovering from this pandemic. There's hundreds and millions of families who are struggling to make ends meet, and we need a steady hand on at the federal level to continue to steer our country out of this pandemic and continue to provide the necessary support to families that is required. So absolutely, it was a lapse in judgment on part of him, but they have been handling the overall pandemic crisis really well, supporting families and business, and they should continue to do that.
Corey, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a fair assessment of the way Canadians might view it? A mistake was made, it was wrong, but in the overall context of leadership, this isn't enough to end things?
Well, I think ultimately it'll be decided at the polls in the next election. I don't think that the Prime Minister is going to commit seppuku because the opposition suggested it. But I do think Mary Dawson's frustration has got to be one that's shared more broadly by Canadians who follow politics and who follow this Prime Minister. To keep making the same sorts of errors again and again is a bit mind-boggling. It kind of makes you wonder who's in his office and what is the clerk's office and the Privy Council office doing to not throw some flags on the field. At what point do you keep making a mistake again and again? But I don't think he's going to step aside. But I do think he's been damaged by this and will continue to be damaged by it.
Françoise, what do you think?
Well, a few things. I mean, yes, I felt the frustration from Mary Dawson, but it shows the frustration based on that whole legislation, because she said something very important. To one of your questions, what happens if he's found that he contravened? Not much happens. So there'll be report number 3. The opposition parties will voice that during the next campaign. We already know that after 2 reports of contraventions, the public re-elected that Prime Minister. So that's what we do in Canada. You commit an infraction on ethic and you get re-elected. So there must be some type of frustration. I think if there was something a bit more crunchy as a penalty, then you wouldn't have that blind spot that she was talking about. I thought it was super interesting, the position that the Bloc Québécois was taking. Because it's not so much about the whole we affair. I think it's more about if they could get rid of Justin Trudeau, but they don't have the guts to go into an election because they're not ready. So let's bring somebody that has zero recognition in Quebec, like Chrystia Freeland. I thought it was a smart kind of move.
So you think it's strategic?
Very strategic. Yeah. It's divide to conquer. But at the same time, I have to be honest. I mean, I think everybody in the cabinet was at that table, knew the involvement of the Liberal Party and many other parties, by the way, with the We organization, should have signaled something. So I think there might be a bit more people in contravention. It's going to be interesting to follow what the Ethics Commissioner has to say on the whole thing, because I don't think Chrystia Freeland voiced her moment. She's the Vice Premier Minister. So maybe she's not at her place also. I don't feel like there's an adult in the room.
Amarjeet, let me ask you on the question, on the point that Françoise first made, and that is around the fact that there aren't any penalties involved with contravening the act. Actually, Mary Dawson takes a very different view than Mario Dion, the current commissioner, in that she doesn't think there should be. She thinks that the sort of in general, the public nature of those reports is enough, and that penalties should be in the criminal domain. Mario Dion wants the office to have more teeth. I wonder, when you're talking about deterrence, though, whether you think it would make a difference, right? If there was an actual consequence beyond what might happen at the polls, do you think that would impact the way decisions are made? Or, like Françoise and Corey point out, would more people around the table or in the office be saying, hey, this doesn't look good?
Well, I don't think there was any ill intention in awarding the contract to we. The whole purpose was to get the money out as quickly as possible. Absolutely, they should have done their due diligence to flag the perceived conflict of interest and Prime Minister's family's involvement. I think this government is really good at tackling big issues of climate change, poverty, supporting families, in this case, handling the pandemic. But they're very negligent in managing small things in a way that they could avoid these self-inflicted wounds. And this is one of those self-inflicted wounds. But Corey is right. Public accountability is what counts. At the end of the day, Canadians would make their judgment based on the overall performance of the Prime Minister and the overall performance of this government.
Let me just follow up with you quickly, Amarjeet, because you've been on the inside of the government. What do you think it is? Why do you think, if in fact they aren't great at the small things, or they're overlooking what seems obvious later, why do you think that is?
Well, I think in this case, over the last number of months, this government has been on the move all the time. There's the issue of the Ukrainian airline crash. Then there was issue of the pandemic and the response and the recovery, and then the issue of protests related to racism and discrimination and the blockades on pipelines. So this government hasn't had a break, or many of their ministers haven't had the chance to even breathe and sit back and reflect. So in this kind of atmosphere, it's natural that you will overlook some of these things that should have never been overlooked in my mind, and you end up making these mistakes.
Corey, I'm going to ask you the same question. You've been on the inside of a different government. What do you think? What do you think is behind if they are overlooking stuff like that? Why do you think so?
Well, I don't think they're overlooking it. I think they're upset that they got caught, but they've not gotten caught on I think on many other things due to I think a focus of being very much on pandemic and other issues. But what smacks of this is not just the personal conflict, and let's just be clear, it's not a perceived conflict. It's a actual conflict, is one part of it. But the second part is this is a liberal friendly organization. This would be like saying, I don't know, the Fraser Institute or something. Doesn't have any ideological tint. This is a liberal organization that has been using money to run election-style ads that basically look like personal Prime Minister campaign ads with money. And they're not really so much a private organization. They're getting a lot of public money funneling through this. So I think it's self-dealing in a much more concerning political way. Like I actually find that portion of it far more concerning than the personal benefit in the Trudeau family, because and if you want to have the worst view of it, it's funneling taxpayer money through government programs to organizations that are going to carry water for you ideologically and in a very real campaign sense. So I think it's too cute by half, and I think that it's a lot more than a perception. So I don't buy that these guys are tired. I don't buy that either. That's why things go past. If that's the case, step down from government and let somebody else be in charge. I don't think it's that. I think this is quite deliberate.
Françoise, I'll give you the final word on this subject. My guess is the burden of proof for what Corey just described is a lot higher than, for example, what Mary Dawson cited, which is contravention of the act where it pertains to recusal. We know from the Prime Minister's admission that he says he should have recused himself. I mean, there is a lot of, for example, of what Corey was talking about, a lot of allegations when it comes to that charity. I mean, there's a ton of investigation, I think, to be done around that charity in and of itself and its involvement with the government. I think the whole idea of the sole source contract, there are questions around that too, but a lot of that stuff hasn't been proven yet.
No, exactly. But there's a lot of channel that can be taken. I mean, the Finance Committee is going to review a lot of things, and it's going to be interesting to see the documents, the testimonies, the information that I was hearing on CBC today during the different news report about the charity and how the program was about to be dispensed, raised tons of questions in my mind, because having been an MP, and I'm sure Majid lived the same thing. Every year before summer, we had to review all the files in our writings, the little budget that was awarded by writing for summer jobs. And it sounds a lot like it, but a lot of the echoes I used to get from the little charities that were doing job and needed so badly those students to give them a formation, but at the same time to be able to deliver some services based on their own charity or their own little non-profit organization. There was so much red tape, so much everything. And I'm hearing, we'll give you ideas on what type of jobs you can make those students do. We will do this and that. I think we have so many more information to get from this. And that's why it's not little things like Amarjit was saying. It's huge thing. It's programs that receive millions, hundreds of millions of dollars during the pandemic that we might realize at some point in time that there was no boundary. It was kind of, let's go to our friends first because we know them, and it's so natural. It's so
we're waiting on. I mean, the government's contention. I'm going to take a commercial, and we'll be back with another subject. But the government's contention is that the bureaucracy did recommend this as the most viable option. We have yet to see the paperwork for that. Last night, Bardish Chagger said that if they can make it available to the committee to study, that they will. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.